Hello everyone, and welcome back to a brand new episode of Front Row on Economy.lk. Joining with me on conversation is Harsha Basnayake, who is the Deputy Area Managing Director for Ernst & Young Asia Pacific. Hi Harsha, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sharan. Thank you for having me.
Harsha, if I was to get into my first question, we are really seeing a lot of shifts in the global supply chains, both pre the pandemic as well as right now as economies are recovering. From where you stand in Singapore, how can really Sri Lanka utilize these shifting dynamics to attract trade and FDI opportunities?
Yeah, so I think the supply chain shift started to happen way before COVID came about, primarily because of the US China tensions. Many of the companies were actually pressured to think about relocating and diversifying their footprints, and it got exacerbated because of COVID. Because it's not just manufacturing of goods, but also food supply chains also got disrupted. And it was very clear for many of the companies that the concentration that they had in certain locations, when a pandemic like this hits, there was no alternatives, and it was very difficult to arrange those alternatives. So our view is that there is a much more accelerated movement of relocation and regionalization that is happening. The movement is more closer to home or to diversify into other locations, right? So there's an interesting observation that we have. As companies are doing this, they are more ready to sacrifice some element of efficiency to contingency planning. So there's a cost to that, and they're prepared to actually bear that. And certainly from my firm's perspective, we are advocating those companies that are relocating from China in particular to think about a China plus strategy, meaning there are some who have actually invested into China many years ago, and it's a large footprint, and China itself is a very large market. So we're asking them to repurpose and think through other locations, and markets like Vietnam, Indonesia, and India are appearing to be quite strong alternatives. And I think there is an opportunity for Sri Lanka because we do have a history of bringing companies on board for them and relocating their manufacturing footprints into Sri Lanka. Textiles, and if you go beyond textiles, right? We used to actually have the free trade zones much before any of the other markets in Asia. So we got to be very thoughtful about what sectors that we need to identify. And when you think about those sectors, you got to think through availability of labor and the transfer pricing arrangements that we have got with different markets. Land availability, infrastructure, access to ports and airports, etc., has to be very thoughtfully done. But what we have not done, though, at least I have not seen a concerted campaign to get it moving, right? You got to actually engage these companies, you got to port them, you got to showcase the proposition and bring them along. And I think that's the journey that we have to be on.
Thanks, Harsha, for that detailed explanation. What this period has also highlighted, Harsha, is the importance of really partnerships to manage economies, be it international actors, governments, private sector, international aid agencies, all in reviving the economy. And from Sri Lankan context, how can Sri Lanka really learn from some of the other countries in the Asia Pacific that are leveraging on partnerships?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I am a huge advocate of public-private partnerships, and when you think about public sector and private sector, there's also another component that we should not forget, which is really the employees. If you take a country like Singapore, I think one of the strongest success factors that Singapore has got is that tripartite arrangement, right, between government, businesses, as well as employees. They've got that really to an art where there is almost an in-sync understanding of the challenges and the parts that the different actors have to play. And that's really a baseline for us. And this is where I think we have not really focused on. We have talked a lot about private sector and government partnership. We have also had multilateral agency partnerships, but I don't think we have actually engaged labor in a very meaningful way between private sector and labor, as well as government and labor. Right? I think that's a very important aspect to keep in mind. But the more important direction in my mind, Shiran, is really the baseline policies, right? I think one of the things that we are suffering is that we have not had a policy framework that is consistent and that has held for a long time, because our policies tend to change depending on the politics of the day. And that is something that we need to be thoughtful about very strongly. I would also say, as we think about free trade, I mean, we immediately, when we think about foreign direct investments, we get our heads more towards governments. But today, we are in a world where multinationals are as powerful as governments, and they can actually bring a very different proposition to a country like ours, right? So my advice would be that just as we have got people to engage in multilateral as well as government-to-government partnership building, we got to also think about how do we engage the multinationals. I mean, you think about the multinationals that have really succeeded in Sri Lanka. They are the ones that have been with us for a long time, right? And they were invited probably during the post-colonial days. But since then, we have not had a proper campaign, and the large tech players that are there, the large multinationals that are there, are really in a place where we must have a game plan to engage them and bring them over and entice them to actually set up their businesses and their footprints in Sri Lanka and help us. And I think there are many who will actually come forward to do that.
Thank you, Harsha. If you bring it all together and get into the final question, I know you've already addressed some of the factors, some of the key structural reforms and the weaknesses that Sri Lanka should really address. But in this process, what is really the role of the private sector in working in tandem with government, but also addressing some of the other issues that the private sector should encounter in really driving Sri Lanka's economic revival?
Yeah, so I think our private sector is weak because of several factors, right? I think if you look at our industries, I mean, we are still banking on a very few industries in our economy, right? So the income sources that we think about, the income sources that we have got, we've got a very narrow spectrum. We've got to diversify that. And you can only diversify that if you actually are able to invite those industries to come and have a foothold, right? You take the garment sector. I mean, since when we made a bet to actually go into the garment sector, we've been able to attract the entire ecosystem to get built out very, very nicely, and it has played out for the long haul for us, right? So we got to make a bet on a few of those verticals and create ecosystems that they will actually take a deep root in the country and carry on for the long haul. Right? I think that's something that we need to be thoughtful and mindful about if you're serious about diversifying. The other aspect I would also say, we got to modernize, right? So IT, digitalization and IT is something that we need to place a bet on and think about how do we modernize our businesses, modernize our industries. I mean, every country has got programs to enable SMEs, to enable their local businesses to step up. If we continue to do things in the old ways, it doesn't really work. It doesn't give us the efficiency that we're looking for, and it also doesn't give us the market access that we're looking for. Because when you think through markets, also beyond the geographical markets, right? There is also the e-commerce market that actually provides a fantastic opportunity for us. But we can only engage the e-commerce markets if our businesses have got some digitalization footprint. So that's something that I think we should focus on as well.
Thank you, Harsha. I think you really brought a lot of views to this conversation, really highlighting both from a global side, what are some of the trade shifts, and really how focusing on some of the internal factors, we can really attract some of these investments into Sri Lanka. We also, I think, talked about really the role of MNCs and kind of, the work that they could potentially bring about to Sri Lanka, and finally, really the role of the private sector in really driving this economic recovery. So to our viewers, I hope you found it as insightful as I did. Thank you, Harsha, once again, and please stay tuned for insightful videos like this on Economy.lk.